Hi, my name is Trainmaster04, and in this product review video, I'll be reviewing Lionel's latest addition to their Vision Line fleet, and it is possibly the most unique locomotive ever built, and it is the Erie Triplex, engine number 5014.
Union Pacific 4014. Do you read me? Over. Roger that. Union Pacific 4014. I copy that. Over. Start up and stand by. Over. Yes, sir. Start up and stand by. Out.
Start this video off, let's go over the history on engine number 5014 and also the triplexes as a whole. Engine number 5014 is considered a P1 class locomotive on the Erie Railroad and has a unique wheel arrangement of two 8882 wheels underneath the boiler and the tender. This locomotive is also designed as a Mallet type locomotive, but with a little bit of a kick. In this case, instead of high-pressure exhaust steam coming out of the center set of high-pressure cylinders, going directly into the front set of low-pressure cylinders and then being exhausted off, the exhausted high-pressure steam is actually diverted to both the front set and rear set of cylinders. This allowed the locomotive to be both efficient but also distribute its power with what little bit of power is left within the exhausted steam. Now for the rear set of cylinders, that steam is not rediverted back through the smoke box, but instead by an iconic looking smokestack that juts out through the rear of the tender. This locomotive was originally built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in 1914, and in 1916 would eventually receive two siblings, engines number 5015 and also engine number 5016. 5014 in particular was meant to be a prototype of the idea of stretching the Mallet design to its limit by increasing the amount of drivers, so hence increasing the amount of tractive effort, but also increasing the efficiency by using the exhausted high-pressure steam not once, but twice, and theoretically increasing its longevity. The locomotive was delivered as engine number 2603, and following Erie tradition, they painted engineer Matt H. Shea's name onto the cab of the locomotive, which 5014 wore for many, many years. However, these locomotives, when they were put into service onto the Erie Railroad, found themselves in quite a predicament. 5014 and her siblings, when they were delivered, were meant to be the pinnacle of drag freight haulers, where they would be able to go along the Erie Railroad's steep grades that had winding turns, but still have plenty of power to move all of the pre-war freight that they need to get done. However, these locomotives on paper were only good on said paper. When they got on the high iron, it was found out that these locomotives did have an incredible amount of power, something that would only be later seen on the Union Pacific Railroad's Big Boys and many other similar articulated locomotives, such as those on the Chesapeake and Ohio and Norfolk and Western. But during this time of the teens and into the 20s, the Erie Railroad's rolling stock fleet had couplers that could not withstand the sheer power that these locomotives can actually put out. As a result, when these locomotives were put at the head end of any freight train and were yanked upon the back end of those cars, knuckles would literally be flying. As a result, these locomotives were delegated to helper or pusher services on both the Gulf Summit, or otherwise known as the Susquehanna Hill grade, near the Deposit, New York. As a result, these locomotives, though they had great ideas on paper, still had yet even more flaws ahead of them. In this case, steam and also traction. 5014 and her other siblings would suffer two primary problems besides knocking couplers out of their positions. In this case, it would be between her boiler and the tender itself. Starting with the boiler, the locomotives found themselves exhausting their steam supply when reaching over 10 miles per hour. It was soon deduced that the locomotive wasn't underpowered in the sense of producing steam, but instead was being hurt in the amount of water it can actually inject into its boiler. The feed water heater that were put onto engines number 5014 through 5016 was inadequate to be able to inject enough heated water into the boiler to then resupply itself so that more steam could be produced when demand is needed. As a result, these locomotives were quite crippled, especially the Virginian version of the triplex, Class XA, with a 2.888 four-wheel arrangement, which was limited to only 5 miles per hour. Quite an oversight, that, in my opinion. And then the other issue was actually tractive effort. Though this locomotive had the same principles as any other Mallet locomotive, other than them being a third set of drivers underneath the tender, something that was not considered on paper was the fact that the weight on top of the third set of wheels would actually decrease when the locomotive was in operation. Traditionally, with any steam locomotive, most of the driver's weights come from the boiler and firebox itself. Since that weight is continuous with maybe minor fluctuation depending on how much water is in the boiler, really did not matter when it came to the overall weight. However, since the tender is primarily just 2 containers with a sitting on a frame and just simple sheet metal, the weight on the tender itself would change drastically. In the case for the Erie Triplexes, as the locomotive would go down the line using up coal and water, the weight would deplete and cause the rear set of drivers to lose adhesion on the rails and immediately slip. Another failure that caused the Erie Triplexes, as well as the Virginian Triplex, to find themselves being scrapped in 1929 to 1933. Now let's move over to the model itself and go over all the stats and facts of it. This model was formally announced to the public around October-November of 2023, and then further details such as more details on the model itself, sets, and other cars associated with it in Lionel's Volume 1 2024 catalog. For the measurements, this locomotive has a whopping 27.25 inches, making this have a minimum curve radius of 0.72. On the shipping date, these locomotives are fairly new on modelers' layouts, being shipped out around late September, early October of 2024. Now, do take note when you do order one of these locomotives that both the locomotive and tender are actually semi-permanently attached, this being due to a pivot pin underneath the cab. So, the shipping box itself is going to be extremely long as both the locomotive and tender are shipped together instead of separately as you would expect with any other steam locomotive. Under the hood, this model is powered by not one, but 2 large flywheel motors, one being located in the typical area round in the firebox, but the second one being located in the tender. The reason being is Lionel, in order to produce their wheel slip feature, had to go and isolate the third set of drivers. So the tender itself has its own antenna, electronics, and motor itself. It is essentially its own separate locomotive. In this case, it really does allow this locomotive to function quite nicely with even power distributed between all 3 driver units, and also puts less strain on the large flywheel motor in the locomotive itself. For other features, this locomotive is equipped with 3 fan-driven smoke units, one located up front for the smokestack, one in the middle for the smoking whistle, and then the third one for the smokestack on the tender. This locomotive is also equipped with Lionel's swinging bell feature with a nice brass bell up top of the boiler. And then for electronics, this locomotive is equipped with Lionel's Legacy rail sounds and also Legacy command control. Since this locomotive is one of Lionel's newest Vision Line locomotives, this means that the Legacy command system is actually quite up to date with 4-digit addressing system, which means you can operate this locomotive using Lionel's new Base 3, use Lionel's former Legacy Cab 2 remote, their original command system, otherwise known as the TMCC Cab 1 remote, Bluetooth, or even conventional. Now, if you want to access all of these wonderful features in this locomotive, I would suggest using Lionel's Cab 3 or Cab 2 command systems. But for ease of operations and still get all those features, I would definitely suggest using your old Cab 2 remote, as with the wheel slip features and a few other things with the Cab 3, which that would be a topic for another day, is a little finicky with this locomotive, whereas the physical handheld remote of the Cab 2 is much more desirable. With the model stats and facts of all the features out of the way, let's go ahead, take a closer look, and see all of the wonderful separately applied and molded in detail this Vision Line model has to offer. Starting at the front of the locomotive, and as you can see, the pilot is nicely detailed and is quite large for a locomotive of this stature, considering that it actually has to cover up and over the pilot wheels and also the first set of massive low pressure cylinders. But overall, it does make quite an appearance when you're looking straight at front of the locomotive. Detail-wise, starting at the bottom, Lionel has included two nice crew steps for crews to actually stand up on front of the locomotive to easily have access to the front coupler when decoupling from the back end of a train on helper service. There's also a separately applied brake hose with a nice hand-painted detail, in this case in the form of silver paint at the end of the hose. Two separately applied flagpole stanchions, separately applied coupler cup bar with separately applied fitted chain that does go down into the center of a scale O-gauge coupler. In this case, this coupler can be swapped out for a dummy O-gauge coupler, but in the process, you'll notice that it's actually a little bit more finicky, where you'll have to turn the locomotive upside down in order to access the mounting screw, instead of the typical mounting screw up top, like on other Lionel locomotives. But in this case, it is still possible, and you can go ahead and double head this locomotive, or more importantly, equip this locomotive for push or helper service duties. Up top, besides the two flag stanchions, there are these nicely detailed grab irons that run along the length of the pilot itself, with three nice safety treaded steps leading up eventually to the smoke box. Moving up to the smokebox front itself, this is definitely a locomotive typical of the 19-teens. In this case, the headlamp, in this case, is very square and ornate, something very prototypical to a locomotive of this age, and really does make this locomotive look quite unique in comparison to other more modern steam locomotives. Detail-wise, the headlamp itself is nicely detailed with ornate bits, a separately applied number board underneath the light itself with the crisp 5014, two illuminated number boards on either side of it, an LED light so that when your locomotive's in operation, it can produce the Rule 17 without any problems, and also down in the future, the headlamp will never go out and cause you some headache on trying to replace it as compared to older TMCC locomotives with incandescent bulbs. On either side of the headlamp and smokebox door, there are two separately applied marker lights, which do come on when the locomotive is in operation and can be changed from either green, white, or simply be turned off for prototypical operation. And finally, in this area, there are two separately applied boiler grab irons or handrails that come curling off of the smokebox and down to a point. For the final detail that is kind of not really seen that often, but is still quite nice, is the fact that the boiler front actually does open up quite nicely, revealing not any form of detail, but is still a nice feature considering this is a high-scale model. Moving over to the engineer side of the locomotive, starting at the bottom, working up to the top, here you can see at the bottom is the first set of 3 8-driving wheels, as well as the first set of 2 low-pressure cylinders. In this case, the underside of the locomotive is nicely detailed with the correct Baker valve gear on the running gear, various white wall wheels, such as the driver's as well as the pilot wheels, polished cylinder caps on the cylinders, and variously good-looking polished side rods and linkage running along the first set of drivers. In this case, this is a very interesting area considering for clearance on your track, especially considering if you have trackage that is not Lionel Fast Track or some kind of other Lionel product. In this case, I have also experienced, along with other people who have received these Erie Triplexes, problems with switch machines and also other various high-setting track equipment hitting on either these cylinders or even this side rod linkage. and later on some steps on the tender. So definitely, when you get one of these locomotives, pay attention to your clearances and hopefully you'll be just fine. On Atlas, it's a bit of a toss-up as I've had some good and bad situations with this locomotive. Moving on up, here is the running board, which runs along the entire length of the locomotive and does quite look nice with the safety tread on top and various other separately applied and molded in detail underneath it, such as some exhaust steam piping going out from the smoke box itself, separately applied air tank reservoir, along with some various cooling piping for the air compressors and a separately applied power reverser. Up on the boiler, here you can see the beautiful crisp paint of the Russian iron as well as the correct graphite gray boilers and various other molded in and separately applied details, making this entire boiler look very, very crisp and nice. For the details wise, there are molded in rivets, steps, as well as boiler bands, and separately applied piping off of one of 3 sand domes, steam piping coming off from the top of the boiler, as well as 2 separately applied builder's plates, and the continuation of that separately applied handrail along the length of the boiler. Continuing down the locomotive, starting again at the bottom, here is the second set of 8 driving wheels. In this case, this is the high pressure cylinder, and in video you really cannot notice that this cylinder is actually smaller than compared to a high pressure cylinder, but if you actually get one of these models in person, I can assure you that there is a significant difference in person than compared to on video. In this case, this set of 8 drivers are practically identical to the other 2 sets, in this case still having the Baker valve gear, but in this case having a smaller set of cylinders. Detail-wise, the running boards do come to an end towards the cab, and the drivers on this middle set is kind of obscured by the massive firebox on this locomotive. In this case, the firebox is nicely detailed with various molded in and separately applied details, such as a separately applied metal ash pan. In this case, this locomotive is equipped with the variable ash pan glow effect, which means when the locomotive is moving, there will be a nice red light glowing through the ash pan for everybody to see, and will get brighter and brighter as the locomotive is working harder and harder. Firebox is also painted in the correct graphite gray and is littered with multiple rivets for stay bolts and also just flexible stay bolts. It's accompanied by a separately applied steam pipe and then also covered by the running board itself. On top of the boiler, the firebox is still nicely detailed with washout plugs and boiler bands, which are molded into the body. Various separately applied pipe work running along outside of the cab. In this case, this big one is actually an injector coming off of the turret on top of the boiler. Here you can see is the second of 3 steam domes. In this case, it is quite unique with various linkage going right through it, and then pipe work coming down to support the drivers. Has this nice molded in grab iron for safety, and then along the side of the boiler, coming towards the end of the boiler itself, is the end of that handrail. Finally, taking a look at the cab itself, it is one of the biggest cabs I have seen in a long time. It is really beefy compared to this locomotive, and in contrast to the Russian iron blue, the black and gold really does stand out. In this case, for detail, the cab is detailed with a bunch of molded in rivets, 3 windows, 2 of which are adjustable, so you can actually move and position the cab windows however you would like, and they do have clear plastic inserts in them to symbolize glass. There is a nice molded in window ledge for the crew to rest their arm on, and then in the center, this locomotive is numbered 5014, so this is the Matt H. Shea in her later iteration with her 5014 number. And then underneath the numbers themselves is the locomotive classification. In this case, it is P1. Typically, this is where I change the perspective of the camera, show you the interior of the cab, and also continue on with the locomotive, such as going on top of the boiler. But since this locomotive is unique, that means there is going to be a different and unique approach. So, continuing from the locomotive cab down to the third set of drivers, in this case, the tender itself, Here you can see the third set of drivers as well as the trailing wheels, or in this case tender supporting truck, however you want to look at it. And the tender itself is quite a unique piece of equipment, considering that it is something you really do not see in the real world of modern steam. In this case, it too is nicely detailed with molded in rivet along the side paneling, is nicely lettered in the correct Erie font and gold, similar to the engine number 5014. Detail-wise, underneath, the 8 set of drivers are also nicely white-walled, has a nice molded-in ladder going up into the cab, associated with 2 separately applied grab irons, one on the tender and one on the cab. And for the pony truck itself, it has some very nice molded-in details, such as rivets, bearing boxes, and also a massive leaf spring, which was prototypical for the real Erie Triplexes. Looking at the back of the locomotive, or in this case, technically the back of the tender, starting at the bottom, here you can see there are a couple of more of those molded-in platforms for crews to stand on while the locomotive is moving at X amount of speed, and it's associated with 2 molded-in steps leading up to the back platform. In the center, there is a separately applied coupler cup bar, which it unfortunately does not have a chain connected to it, due to, in the center, there being the locomotive's electrocoupler. In this case, the electrocoupler can be thrown by using either Lionel's Cab 3, Cab 2, or Team CC remote, and even Bluetooth. Up top on the back panel itself, Lionel has not skipped on any detail. In this case, there are separately applied grab irons on either side, one in the center behind the coupler cup bar, a separately applied ladder leading up to the upper deck of the tender, 2 separately applied marker lights, which, similar to the front marker lights, can be changed color. However, they can be changed from red, white, or even be simply turned off instead of being changed to green or white. For molded-in detail, the locomotive is nicely detailed with various rivets all around the back panel. And then finally, reaching out to the elephant in the room, there is the tender smokestack. As stated earlier on in the history segment of this video, in order for the exhaust steam for the third set of cylinders to, well, be exhausted, the Erie Railroad opted to allow the steam to be exhausted in its own channel out through the tender. In this case, the tender itself is equipped with its own smoke generator, and in this case, in order to fill it, instead of making its own fill hole, say up top on the tender, Lionel has opted to keep MTH's idea and simply pouring the smoke fluid directly down the stack. Now, unfortunately, unlike the MTH version, there is a little seam right here on the smokestack where the original tooling was designed to where you can actually take this extension off and have a better time filling the smoke unit with smoke fluid, as there would be less metal to go down into. But unfortunately, as I've handled this model, I have not been able to take this extension off, and the instructions did not say this is able to come off. So I would assume that this stack extension is permanent to the locomotive. Moving over from the back of the tender, here is a best shot view of the cab interior itself. Since the locomotive and tender are semi-permanently attached with a screw and also have various wires joining themselves together underneath the cab, this is really only the best way I can actually give you a good view of the cab without detaching the locomotive and tender from each other and possibly causing some damage to it. But as you can see, the cab is not as detailed as you would expect from a Vision Line locomotive, as there's not a lot of valves or gauges to be seen that are either separately applied or even hand painted. But there are various details in there, such as unique, massive molded in piping coming off of the back head itself and going to various places, probably supplying various cylinders and also various other appliances on the locomotive. The cab is populated with 2 new hand-painted crew figures, one for the fireman and one for the engineer side. Underneath the low-pressure cylinder for the tender, you can see a bit of the firebox glow coming out of the firebox itself and emanating down onto the cylinders. Inside the cab itself, there are 2 small firebox doors with little peepholes, so you can actually see the firebox glowing red hot as the locomotive's in operation. On the outside back head of the cab itself, there are 3 separately applied die-cast metal curtains, one for each side and one up above, to keep the crew nice and warm in turbulent weather. There are also molded in rivet details on the back panel with 2 windows with clear plastic inserts, and then on the floor itself there is a separately applied tender deck plate. Now do keep in mind with the tender deck plate, it can have the ability to actually fall in between the locomotive's cab and tender when you are actually picking up this locomotive. To prevent this from happening during shipping, Lionel has included a foam piece that sits in between this space, but in order to get it out, you will actually have to tilt the locomotive and tender away from each other to create a bigger gap in between the upper portion of the cab roof and the upper portion of the tender, and then feed it out. In this operation, this is where the gap in between the locomotive cab deck and the tender deck can increase and allow that drop plate to literally fall in between the 2 spaces. So I would recommend definitely doing this procedure with at least 2 people, one person holding the locomotive itself and then another one pulling out the protective foam piece. And when you put it on the track, ensure that this deck plate is seated properly on top of the tender deck. The top of the locomotive boiler, starting from the smoke box and working down to the end of the tender. Here on the smoke box itself and beginning of the boiler, as you can see, it is fairly not really detailed in the sense of major appliances being attached on top of here, but that is pretty prototypical for these early teens locomotives. Starting with the main smokestack, as you can see, it is nicely, seamlessly attached to the smoke box itself. And in this case, as stated earlier on in this video, this locomotive is equipped with 3 fan-driven smoke units, one for the main smokestack, one for the main whistle, and then one for the tender later on down in this video. In order to fill the smokestack smoke unit as well as the whistle, you simply just pour the smoke fluid directly down the stack. Now do take note that in order to get smoke fluid to the whistle, it may take a little bit of time for the smoke fluid to trickle along through the boiler and end up in the smoke unit down here. As a result, you may not receive a plume of smoke coming out of the whistle immediately after you refill both smoke units, as the tube may be slightly blocked and require a little bit of time. Best way to remedy this is to either blow down the hole for the smoking whistle or blow down directly down the stack and help free up any of that blocked fluid. Continuing down the boiler, here is some more separately applied pipework from the feed water heater. One of 3 sand domes, which is nicely painted in this matte black, various molded in boiler bands and boiler jacketing clips, separately applied bell, which is nicely polished as turned brass, has a separately applied bell cord, and as stated earlier on in this video, this locomotive is equipped with this swinging bell feature, so when you activate the bell, this actual bell detail should actually swing back and forth. Coming towards the end of this shot, here is the steam dome, also painted in that matte black, with various equipment coming off of it, such as the throttle linkage and a monkey's tail to allow any air trapped within the boiler to escape as it's heating up, 3 sets of separately applied brass poppet valves, and then the whistle itself with a separately applied whistle cord going back to the cab. Moving down to the cab, here you can see are the 2 other sand domes, which are uniquely spaced and separated between each other, and also have 2 molded in sand dome caps so that the sand internal wise can stay dry. Towards the cab itself, here are various other pieces of equipment, such as a molded in turret, which would contain all of the piping that would lead to all of the steam-powered equipment throughout the locomotive. On the cab itself, it is nicely detailed and painted in black with molded in rivet detailing crisscrossing along the roof. And then in the center, there are 2 separately applied vent hatches, which do open and close like so. And concluding with this upper portion of the video, since both the tender and locomotive are attached to each other, I decided to go ahead and make it all in one. For detail-wise, the locomotive's tender is nicely detailed with molded in rivet detailing along the coal bunker and on top of the water tank. There are 2 molded in toolboxes right against the coal bunker itself, And then towards the rear by the smokestack for the third set of drivers is a separately applied water hatch tank, which can be opened, but in this case it only reveals a blank space. Now, you may notice that I've actually skipped over one important detail that it would be expected to have gone over first, and that is the realistic coal load itself. The reason why I actually skipped over the coal load itself is because there is a nice little hidden secret underneath it. Since the tender itself is actually its own little locomotive with its own legacy command board, rail sounds board, and also motor and smoke unit, this tender requires some form of an antennae in order for it to operate seamlessly against the locomotive. In this case, Lionel has opted to actually use the coal load as its antennae, so it is actually removable and attached by a little wire. Now, the second reason why Lionel has opted to allow this tender load to actually be detachable is to access all of the operation switches to operate this locomotive. In this case, the switches include the run program switch, the Bluetooth on and off switch, which I'll get back to in a minute because there is something I need to mention, especially since this is a 4-digit locomotive, the main smokestack on and off switch, whistle steam on and off, and the tender smoke on and off. Coming back to the Bluetooth switch, typically on any Bluetooth equipped locomotive, this would just simply be an on and off switch so that users can decide whether they want to use Lionel's Bluetooth app or just use it under the legacy command system. But with these new 4-digit operating systems, Lionel has unfortunately not told the public that there's actually a caveat when it comes between the operating system of Bluetooth and the 4-digit addressing system. In this case, they cannot work simultaneously. In this case, Lionel has switched the Bluetooth on and off switch to include selecting whether you want to use Bluetooth or the 4-digit addressing system. In other words, if you want to use the Bluetooth, you're going to have to program your locomotive under 2 digits or just simply have the Lion Chief Bluetooth app open and use the minimum amount of features available on said app. Now, if you want to use your Cap 2 or more importantly, program this locomotive under 4 digits using the new Base 3 and Cap 3 app, you will have to turn off the Bluetooth feature and set it to the 4-digit system. Really something I have no idea why Lionel did not go and tell the public about this, other than, more importantly, including it in their owner's manual, especially since they have now digitized it, really does not make any sense to me. So it was really important to me to actually show that to you all. To hide the wires and also the switches themselves, it is a little finicky with that antenna wire, but it simply just sits back on top of the tender deck itself and is held down by magnets, and once realigned properly, really hides everything underneath it very seamlessly. Finally, taking a quick look at the fireman side of the locomotive, and as you can see, it is practically identical as compared to the engineer side, but there are a few minute differences, such as the addition of various separately applied pipework running along the length of the boiler, 2 separately applied air compressors, some more air compressor tanks underneath the running board, and also a better view of the bell as well as the whistle, with both of their leads going back towards the cab. With the locomotive taken care of, let's go ahead, fire up this model, and go over all the sound features.
Train 1 Brakeman, 5014. Let's get an application for continuity test. Good application. Okay to release. Train 1 Brakeman, we have good set, good release, good continuity on timetable train number 1. Over. Yeah, that's Roger. Good set, good release, good continuity in timetable train number 1. 5014 out.
With the locomotive fired up, let's go ahead and go over all the sound features. First up, here are the 5 different whistles equipped on this model. Next up, here are the 5 different bells. Here is the steam blowdown sound. Here is both the coal and water fill-up sounds.
The coal's full. Out. The water tank's full. Out.
And finally, here is a sampling of both the crew and Towercom chatter, which I can say have been modified and should be a bit of a refreshment compared to older audio files.
Hey, George, can you even see the front end of this thing from there? We got 62 today. Let's see if marketing shiny new object is worth anything on a real job. How's our coal? You know it won't last long. 5014 to Susquehanna. Station work complete. Ready to head west. Can I pull? Hold your position. Susquehanna dispatch out. The coal's full. Out. Get that fire hot. We might as well leave start with a good head of steam.
Alrighty, with the locomotive sound features over with, I've got some cars hooked up behind the tender, so let's go ahead and take this triplex out for a spin on the layout.
5014 to the tower. We're stopped. I'll let you know when I'm rolling. 5014 out. We're gonna need a bigger coal scoop. Don't forget to oil the rods under that tender, too. We got 62 today. Let's see if marketing's shiny new object is worth anything on a real job. Erie 5014 to Susquehanna. Ready to roll. Can I pull? Please stand by. Out. Erie 5014 to the tower. Ready to roll. Can I pull? You can take the green. Out. Dispatch, this is Erie 5014. How's the track look? In the clear? Over. Affirmative, your track is clear. Dispatch out.
Well, that about wraps up this product review, but before you go, let me go ahead and answer the two questions that I normally ask around at this time of the video, and they are, what is the original MSRP price for one of these models, and also, what is my opinion on it? Well, to start off, the original MSRP price for this model is right at $2,500. Now, if you're looking to purchase one of these models, or even one of the various custom-made models that have been going around on the market these days, I would definitely suggest checking out Mr. Muffin's Trains, as he has some fairly darn good deals on these wonderful Vision Line models, and he's also gone ahead and made some custom-made options in the form of a U.S. Army and a few other variations of 5014 without white walls, and also is in connection with Harry Heike, the famous locomotive weatherer. And if you are able to, I would definitely suggest going and speaking to Mr. Muffin's Trains themselves and seeing if you could pick up one of these big locomotives. Moving over to the second question, which was, what is my opinion on this model? Overall, I am actually quite relieved with how these models have come out. When I first heard about the release of these Erie Triplexes and how they were going to have the wheel slip feature, the first thing that came into my head was, oh dear, here we go again. Here comes another high dollar model that is going to have problems right out of the box, specifically problems with the motor on the tender. In my mind, I was thinking that this locomotive was going to be a dead-on arrival like the prototype and have malfunctions with the rear set of drivers, either shorting out the locomotive or basically burning itself out because the wheel slip feature just was a little bit too much for the electronics. But thankfully though, Lionel appears to have done their research with this model, tooled it to where it can actually work properly, and as a result, we have gotten one of the best Vision Line locomotives. Yes, you heard me right, one of the best Vision Line locomotives I have received and operated on this layout in a long time. In comparison to the latest release of the Vision Line Big Boys as well as the Santa Fe 3000s, those locomotives are good, but they had their flaws. Yes, they were good engines. Yes, they had their own flaws, but in comparison to the Erie Triplexes, this is really quite a nice little piece of machinery that I would definitely suggest anybody going out after it. In comparison to the MTH model, which this locomotive is very much closer to akin to, in the sense that this model is actually the former MTH tooled Erie Triplexes but modified, I am quite pleased with how much Lionel has left it alone but improved it with their own little bit of a twist. In this case, some of the better improvements that I do agree with is definitely separating the powertrain into two separate entities instead of producing a model that has the same single drive shaft between one motor connecting the locomotive and the tender drive sets together. If you look back at the MTH models, that's what they actually did. Though it did input enough power across all three drive sets fairly evenly, it was very finicky to actually operate. Overall, I am pleased to announce that this locomotive is a success after a long-awaited hoping that Lionel would actually go and fix their problems. That's it for this product review, but before you go, I just want to say thank you very much for clicking on this video and also watching it to the very end. It takes a long time for me to produce these high quality videos for you all to enjoy, especially as I'm going through life of college. As this video is coming out, I hope you all are able to actually enjoy this video as I did producing it, and also if you wouldn't mind actually going and showing your support that you've actually enjoyed this video by clicking on that like button. That will let me know that this type of content is still wanted and also encourages me to continue to produce more of these videos for you all to enjoy. If you would like to no longer miss any of my future videos, whether they be product reviews, how-tos, or even YouTube shorts, go ahead and also click on that subscribe button, as that will automatically register you into the Trainmaster 04 family and also will give you automatic updates as to when I make new posts. But without further ado, thank you very much again for watching this video, and I'll be seeing you next time.